I recently moderated a candidate forum for congressional candidates and asked where they stood on protecting human life in the womb, and also if there should be exceptions for abortion besides saving the life of the mother. Now, one of the candidates got angry with me and later told me that it was unfair for me to ask that question. But this is a question that Republican voters care about. According to a recent Pew Research survey, 63% of Republicans and independents who lean toward the Republican Party say that abortion should be illegal in all or most cases. Hi, this is Richard Nelson, and you are listening to The Commonwealth Matters. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, according to that same Pew Research survey, they found that 4 out of every 10 Americans believe that an embryo is a person with rights. In other words, they believe that human life begins at conception and that the very earliest stage of that human life, it's a human being that possesses right. I realize that this is a difficult topic. Many people who are tuned in right now, maybe even you, might have been impacted by abortion. Maybe you've had an abortion. And I want to be sensitive to that. You know, we're discussing probably one of the most controversial issues in our lifetime, but I want to address this issue from two perspectives. One is that human life is precious and it's made in the image of God. God is the author of life, and God cares about life, and He cares about protecting that life. And when somebody has done something wrong, made a mistake, maybe had an abortion, we serve a God who is forgiving, a God who can redeem our lives, and that's the good news of the gospel. So those are two important things I need to say at the outset. As I was sharing, this issue very likely the most controversial issue in our lifetime. Again, it's deeply personal. It's tragic when a woman chooses abortion, and it appears overbearing when the law gets involved. Often we hear it said, "Keep your politics out of my womb." That's the refrain anyway. In its heartrending cases, like the one that emerged a few years ago with young Hadley Duvall, who spoke before the Democratic National Convention in 2024, where she shared her story of conceiving at the age of 12 years old after being molested by her stepfather. Now, it was a story championed by Kentucky's Governor Andy Beshear, and it helped to catapult him to a second term when he was up for reelection in 2023. It was an issue, by the way, that Republicans in the 2023 election cycle were not prepared to respond to. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do a program on this issue, on the sanctity of life, abortion, abortion exceptions, and how to address them. And part of it, too, is because it was something that came up in a recent congressional candidate forum that I moderated. So some Republicans are running from this issue, but I contend that they should not run from women like Hadley Duvall, who've been sexually assaulted and conceived. These women need care, and they need support, and they need our love and our attention. They need our community to support them. I would argue that there should be wraparound supports at the legislative level where there are laws that would support a woman who conceives in a sexual assault. I had a chance to talk with legislators and work with legislators a few years ago about proposals that would do that. By the way, the number, it's about 400 women on average per year in Kentucky are sexually assaulted and they conceive. Now, I contend that we need to arrive at a principled position when it comes to the protection of human life and a principled position when it comes to exceptions. And we're going to unpack that in just a few minutes here. All right. So back in January, President Donald Trump told House congressional Republicans to, and I quote, to be a little flexible on the Hyde Amendment. Now, the Hyde Amendment bans federal funding when it comes to abortions. It means you cannot use Medicaid dollars to procure or to have an abortion. I learned earlier this year that while President Trump was recruiting a Kentucky congressional candidate to run against Thomas Massie, Trump met with this person And on the second meeting, Trump asked where he stood on abortion and then on abortion exceptions. And this person told me, I'm not going to name names, but this person told me that he's 100% pro life, no exceptions. And after that, Trump began looking for somebody else to run for that congressional seat. This person told me it was very clear that in that meeting, Trump didn't want to get behind a candidate who was opposed to abortion exceptions. All right. The Dobbs decision back in 2022, this is the Supreme Court decision that essentially struck down Roe v. Wade. It handed the abortion question back to the states. Now, Kentucky is one of 13 states. That's if you include Indiana, because they do have rape and incest exceptions. And they also have freestanding abortion clinics, and they're doing a lot of abortions there. But Kentucky is one of 13 states that bans abortion. But without having a principled position on the protection of unborn human life and dealing with exceptions in a principled way, the threat looms that Kentucky's pro-life protections could be overturned by our state Supreme Court, which leans pro-abortion right now. And if that happens, if there's a challenge to our state law, particularly because we do not have exceptions, if there's a challenge and if the state Supreme Court rules on it, we could have a state level Roe v. Wade. This is why it matters to people like me who've dedicated their entire lives to building up a culture of life and promoting a sanctity of life ethic. I have fought this battle going back to just being out of college. This issue matters to voters. It matters to me. It matters to many people in Kentucky. That's why we passed the trigger bill in 2019, actually 2021. The trigger law passed by wide margins in both the House and Senate. And it said that if Roe v. Wade's ever overturned, Kentucky's a pro-life state, and we will acknowledge that life begins at conception. Now, I'm going to juxtapose this, the conception, life begins at conception, with where dividing line, because not every American and not every in Kentucky believes that life begins at conception. But I want to juxtapose that with the other end of gestation, which is the third trimester. This is where you have those unborn children about to be born. They can live outside the womb. It's about 20 to 22 weeks when, with medical assistance, they can survive outside the womb. The vast majority, 2 out of 3, 3 out of 4 Americans roughly, are opposed to late term abortions. But what principle is at work here? Okay, so you've got a minority that believes it begins at conception. It's about 1 out of 3 Americans. And then a majority that opposes abortions in late term, the third trimester. But what is it? What is the principle that would determine what is acceptable? Is it the size, being that little zygote that you see under a microscope, or the third trimester where you can see that it's almost fully formed baby? Is it the age? What principle is at work here? I want to refer to pro-life activist Scott Klusendorf. He has a group called Life Principles, and he educates pro-lifers. He does workshops for legislators, and he argues from a principled pro-life position. He says that, look, life begins at conception and it should be protected then. He has this acronym called SLED, S-L-E-D. And these are the principles that help him to arrive at that conclusion that it is a human life at conception, and it should be protected by law at conception. So SLED is the acronym. S is the first letter. S stands for size. So should size determine on whether or not a human life should be protected? Well, embryos are smaller than adults. Klusendorf said that doesn't matter. Look, a toddler is smaller than an adult. A 3-year-old is smaller than an adult. Let's go inside the womb. That third trimester baby is smaller than an adult. And yet most Americans believe that that third trimester abortion is wrong. However, in any one of those stages of life, conception, third trimester, the toddler, the 2-year-old, they're smaller than adults, but they're no less human than adults. So L stands for level of development. A fetus, first of all, that zygote, the one cell stage of the human being, um, doesn't have, is not fully formed. It doesn't have organs. It doesn't have a brain. So the level of development, should that determine on whether or not life should be protected? A fetus is less developed than an adult human being, but development does not equal worth. Klusendorf goes on to say that newborns are less developed than adults. Again, toddlers are less developed than adults. What he's getting at is that life is a continuum. It begins at conception. It goes through gestation. There's the baby that's born. There's the toddler stage. There's the young child stage. There's adolescence. There's adulthood. And then there's natural death. There is a continuum of human life. And Klusendorf was arguing that all of the human life along that continuum, along that spectrum, should be protected. So we've talked about size. We've talked about the level of development. The third in the SLED acronym is environment. Environment. A fetus is in the womb, Klusendorf says. We're outside it. And therefore, if it's because the child's in the womb, it should be the mother's choice to have the abortion. Now, location should not determine moral status. It should not determine whether you're protected by law. You don't gain value by changing places. So environment should not matter. And then finally, D stands for degree of dependency. Because the fetus depends entirely on the mother's body, the mother should have the choice to end that life or choose abortion. Now, dependency does not negate value. Again, infants depend entirely on their mother. They're nourished at their mother's breast. They are cared for by their mother. Infants cannot make it on their own. Neither can toddlers or young children, by the way. They're highly, highly dependent on their mothers. So anyways, I found Klusendorf's SLED acronym helpful. Again, SLED, size, L is level of development, E is environment, and D is degree of dependency. I think that's a very, very helpful way for us to arrive at principle. There are several other arguments I want to touch on, and then I want to go to the exception issue. We're going to dig into that a bit. Hi, Richard Nelson here. At CPC, we believe that human dignity and our rights do not come from government, but these are gifts from God that must be protected in every generation. If you agree, may I ask you what you're doing to preserve freedom? Who's fighting for your values? If you're looking for somebody to be your voice with our government, somebody you can trust to promote conservative principles, then would you consider supporting us today? Truth is, we need your help. For $25 a month, you'll receive exclusive content, monthly and quarterly newsletters, special invitations to our events, and legislative and election insights. You can go to our website below to make a donation today. Together, we can leave our children a legacy of freedom and opportunity. So join us today. There's a human equality argument. There's a justice argument. There's a consistency argument. The three-person framework, that's something that Klusendorf unpacks. And I'm not going to go into all of those. I want to land with Robert George, who we've had on this program before. Robert George is a conservative thinker, author. He's a professor at Princeton University. He's one of the most articulate pro-life advocates in the nation. And he has a really good response for those who justify abortion at the earliest stages of life. In particular, one of the strongest arguments that abortion advocates have is that the embryo is potential human life. And Robert George says no. In fact, he frames it this way. He says, you are not a potential human being. You are a human being with great potential. Again, if you believe that life is a continuum, it has a starting point, it has an end point, it has many places of development, many points of development along the way. You're human at every single one of those points and every single one of those places. You're human all the way, and you're a human with great potential. I hope that I'm still a human being with great potential. I don't think God is done with me yet. I think that He's got some work for me to do and some life to live, and hopefully people to bless. Um, but I have potential. My life is not fully realized, fully lived out. And I hope, I've got political opponents, by the way. I hope that they see that because I see that in them. I want to afford the same right to them, and I want to uphold their dignity and their right to life, if you will, as well, even if they disagree with me on this issue. So, Robert George expands on this idea that we are human beings with great potential. And he has written at length, he's given lectures, and just a very, very articulate person. Again, arriving at a place of principle. Again, his arguments are philosophical, they're biological, but they are principled. And one of the main things that he's doing here is he is rejecting the idea that personhood develops later, either at viability, where the child can live outside the womb, or consciousness, which, I mean, some people don't have memories until they're 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. Is that when some place like that? What a random place. That is not a place of principle. So again, George is arguing that personhood develops. It occurs at conception in that zygote, and it's present all throughout life's journey. All right, I want to pivot over to hard cases, and this is what I was criticized for doing when I hosted moderated a candidate forum recently. And the hard cases are this: it's rape, incest, or the mother's life. We'll take the mother's life situation first. There are situations where pregnancies that could threaten the mother's life. Probably the best example is a tubal pregnancy. Um, and this is something where if it's not treated, it will lead to the mother dying. The way I've heard this explained is that there is a secondary effect, the fallopian tube, where that new fertilized egg, the zygote, is not reaching its way to the uterus. If it grows there in the fallopian tube, it's going to kill the mother. Well, the medical intervention is to address the fallopian tube issue. It needs to be fixed. Effect or the consequence is that zygote is not going to survive, and nor would it if it is allowed to grow in the fallopian tube. So there are exceptions to save the mother's life. That's the best example of one. When it comes to rape and incest, these are much, much more difficult to deal with. I mentioned Hadley Duvall. Um, she has the most compelling story I've heard of for abortion exceptions. Her story came to light a few years ago. It was when Andy Beshear was running for reelection for a second term for governor of Kentucky. And the pro life community, the candidates on the ballot, didn't have much to say. Their response was not very good. In fact, they probably cost some people say it cost the Republican candidate for governor the election. So who knows? But what's the response for somebody like Hadley Duvall, 12 years old? She was molested by her stepfather. What's the response? Well, the response is to care for her. The response is to be compassionate to her. The response is to help her. It'd be helpful if there were wraparound laws that could help her. Then the response should be to prosecute the criminal to the fullest extent of the law. To my knowledge, to that date, her stepfather was not charged with any crime. I think that's changed since then, but the law should have come down on him early on. It's been said before that hard cases make bad laws. In other words, find a principle and then move on from there and deal with the hard cases. So the question to ask is that child that's conceived, is that child guilty of something? And then does it deserve punishment? No, I think we will all agree that the perpetrator is guilty, and it's the perpetrator that deserves punishment. They deserve jail time, in fact. So, in this case, if a human life begins at fertilization, and if it is indeed a human life, it should be afforded moral status and protection in our law. Listen to what Lila Rose said of live action. She is one of the most articulate advocates of the pro life cause in the country. She said that children conceived in rape are not less worthy of protection. She says that abortion does not heal trauma, but it adds more violence. It does not take away that a woman has been violated or assaulted. It's simply adding more violence to that woman's life. That's what Lila Rose says. And what about the rapist? As we just said, the rapist should be punished to the fullest extent of the law, not the child. Now, I've gotten to know somebody personally who was conceived in rape. In fact, we've had her on this program years ago. Her name is Brittany Bogard. She's from Hopkinsville. That used to be my stomping grounds years ago, far west Kentucky. And I was introduced to Brittany by a pro-life advocate and friend who thought I should get to know her story. Brittany on this program shared her story. Was very open about it. That's why I'm using her name. She stepped forward. She's been in public. She has shared her story. In fact, she did a commercial advocating for Kentucky's pro-life laws and advocating against abortion exceptions during the 2023 governor's race. So Brittany Bogart put a face on the exceptions issue, just as Hadley Duvall changed our minds and broke our hearts. She put a face on the reason for abortion exceptions. Brittany Bogard put a face on the reasons against abortion exceptions. And when you see her, it's hard to argue against that. Yeah, this is a human life. Brittany's mother was violated, but Brittany's alive, and she is got an amazing story. She's a mom. She also made bad decisions in her life. She went to jail for a number of years, but God got a hold of her at some point and redeemed her life, put her on a different path. She's gone to college. I think she graduated with like close to a 4.0, if not a 4.0, from Murray State University in social work. She's a city council member in Hopkinsville, and she will tell you that she's grateful that her mother looked at her not as some kind of a choice, but saw her as a human being that she was going to care for and nurture. Brittany puts a face on all the other people, men and women, whose mothers might have been sexually assaulted, but they've chosen life for them. I'm going to talk about the politics of the matter, and then we're going to wrap it up. So I received a message after this congressional forum that I told you I moderated, a text message from an influential Republican, and it said this: "I'm very disappointed in what you did to blank." I'm not going to use names here. It's not important. "Not a fair thing to do in a lightning round to blank and blank. If blank wins, Dems will use it against him. We have to be smarter than that." Now, immediately I reached back out to this person. I wanted to talk with them and just share my side. It's very easy, by the way, to send text messages, to drop a text bomb, and then to walk away. I'd rather talk with somebody and try to work through something as difficult as this with them. My response is this, though. If we would have talked over the phone, I would have told them that the candidate forum that I moderated was not a political calculation. I wasn't trying to trap anybody. I was not trying to be unfair to anybody. The purpose of the candidate forum was to let voters know something about the candidates, where they stood on important issues, including difficult issues like the sanctity of life and including abortion exceptions. If the sanctity of life and protecting the unborn is something important to our society, then I want to know what our leaders are going to say about it. And I think that a candidate forum is the best place for them to tell the voters, especially in that particular primary. They can tell voters where they stand on this issue. I'm going to wrap up the political analysis with this, and I'm going to close with some biblical passages that speak to the sanctity of life. I was at an event a year ago where I heard one of Kentucky's top legislative leaders talk about the abortion exception issue and how they've had lively debates in their Republican caucus. And he said this, that he'd rather be in the party that's debating abortion exceptions than in a political party that would allow abortions in the ninth month and for any reason. I thought that helped to bring into focus what's at stake here because, friends, the exceptions issue is a very small number of abortions, even though they're heartrending, and we shouldn't overlook them and the hurt that's involved. But if you look at the thousands of unborn children who are aborted in Kentucky prior to the Dobbs decision, and even today, because most abortions are done through chemical abortions, it's this statement from this legislative leader, just it put a fine point on it. All right. So what does scripture say? Psalm 82, 3-4 says to defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Proverbs 31, 8-9 says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and helpless and see that they get justice. Exodus 23:7 says, do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. Of course, in the Ten Commandments, we're told, thou shalt not kill. Jeremiah 1:5 puts a more personal touch on this. It says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I set you apart. Children are heritage from the Lord. That's what Psalm 127:3 says. Offspring is a reward from him. That's the last passage I'm going to share. There are many other scriptural passages that speak of the sanctity of human life, speaks to protecting human life. It speaks to human dignity. And by the way, scripture is where we get this ethic in the West that values human beings, that protects human beings in law, where we're afforded equal treatment under the law, equal protections before the law. And this is derived from biblical principles. So, all right, with that said, friends, we are out of time. I hope you enjoyed this program. Feel free to share your comments. If you have any thoughts or comments that you'd like to share, send us an email here at the Commonwealth Policy Center. Thank you so much for joining us, and may God bless you.